Hi everyone and welcome to Parkinson's Resource Organization's third annual Recitation of Names, which does complete our week of remembrance. Our work to ensure that no one is isolated because of Parkinson's has always been a labor of love, and the memorial wall is an extension of that love. It's an attempt to capture the real massive human cost of this neglected disorder. It's a privilege to do this work, and it's an honor to take this time every year to remember our lost loved ones. So without further ado, we will begin our recitation of names, and Barbara, take it away.
Joyce Abel, Sharon Ackerman, Sadat Acton, Mark Adams, Mary Adams, Alan Asakjik, Prince Bola Agbana, Douglas Adler, Nelson Aldrich Jr., Muhammad Ali, Tom Allen, Irwin Allen, Ruth Elper, Leonard Altman, Herma Alscher, Michael Apanel, Howard Apple, Jean Arnold, Stephen Atkins, John Attila, Lydia Auschlander, Mike Bacon, Roger Bannister, William Bill Bernard, Gary Barnes, Susan Barrett, Dr. Frank Barta Jr., Marcia Boslow, Charles Boblitz Jr., Alan Bauer, Elaine Baxter, and my father, Robert Bean, Edward Beard, Joseph Beck, Mark Beck, Aaron Beck, Eugene Becker, Nicholas Belridge, Richard Bellman, Joel Bells, Lawrence Bender, Mel Benjamin, Douglas Bennett, Carol Bennett, Gladys Burler Glatz, Adelbert Bernardi, Gerald Bernstein, Susan Barry Emlett, Donald Bursoff, Morris Burzon, Stuart Bigler, Myrna Binderman, Andy Bitta, Jordan Bloomfield, Marilyn Blue, Sandra Blum, Edmund Blum, Ricardo Bloom, Donald Bodell, Tom Bodie, Peter Bogdanovich, Oriel Bohagas, Larry Bowles, Harry Bandereff, Wayne Borlaug, Fernando Botero, Sanford Bothman, Thomas Boyd, John Brehan, Walter Reland, Natalie Bernardi, Don Brown, Arlene Brucker, Richard Brugg, Thomas Breyer, Emily Brzezinski, Constance Buchanan, Jeremy Bullock, Ralph Burnett, Tommy Burnett, Alan Burns, Danton Burrows, Reverend Jack Burton, John Butler, Frank Beitkus, Joseph Bazzetti, Zeta, Terrence Byrne, Charles Cabrera, Raymond Caffarelli, Jerome Kagan, Joseph Campanella, Emilio Campos Jr., Chrysalie Cano Arriaga Hernandez, Robert Cantor, Penny Carducci, Johnny Carletto, Stephen Carlton, Robert Carr, Catherine Carter, Richard Carthridge, Richard Castor, Daniel Cathcart, Donald Kavanaugh, Marcel Charbonneau, John Cherry, Charles Chuck, Nicholas Ciriello, U.S. Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti, Michael Clancy, Mary Carol Louise Clark, Hervey Clare, June Cleaver, Michael Clifton, Charles Klein Sr., Murray Cohen, Bernard Cohen, Alan Kahn, Shelby Collinsworth, Elaine Cummis, Gary Conkoff, Peter Conrad, Jeff Cook, Helene Kaur, Ives Chopins, John Cornell, Dr. Lucien Cota, Nikki Cottrell, Diane Cottrell Tompkins, Marjorie Cowan, Lewis Cox, Larry Cox, James Cox, Edwin Cox, Glenn Cox, James Cox, Josephine Crack, Eugene Creech, Harold Crosby, Robert Cumming, Sir Ian Cuthbert, Joseph Cottuli, Sita Dahl, James Delgado McCready, William Daly, Judith Danka, Terry Daniels, Kalani David, Patricia Davis, John Davis, Denny Del Castillo, Mary Delgado, Lawrence Dennis, Charles Dent, Patrick Deroyan, Camille Dervis, Diane DePrima, Joan Didion, Carl Dietrich, Don Dietrich, Ray Diller, James Dobbins, Roger Dorchy, James Dorskin, Robert Downey Sr., Franklin Drake, Morty Drescher, Saul Dresner, Mildred Dresner, Robert DeBow, Tommy Dubuque, Joe Dudley Sr., Lionel Duffin, David Dunay, Marianne Dunn Warford, Alan Dustin, Beatrice Dyke, Timothy Easterly, Jeffrey Edwards, Fred Edwards, Marilyn Eggerstrom, Abdul Karim Appleby, Leslie Elliott, George Ellison, Raymond Elmore Semro, Joyce Esbenson, Dean Esslinger, Lane Evans, Christopher Evans Miller, Ronald Fahey, Johnny Famechon, Ross Fanning. And it's to you, Michelle. Oh, Wendy, sorry, Wendy.
Francis Fahrenhold, Richard Farmer, Federico Fernandez, John Farabee, Ralph Fertig, Elton Frazier, Bert Fine, Elliot Finkel, Judy Finwall, Jay Fiondella, Louis Fisher, Stephen Fisherman, Jennifer Fitzgerald William, Dr. David Flannery, Harry Fleming, Louis Fletcher, Louis Clearmonte, Raymond Foley, Philip Forbes, John Forbes, Grace Fowler, Larry Friedman, Tom Frensley, John Furnos, David Gabay, Paul Gallagher, Ricky Gardner, David Garretts, Chris Garland, Jane Gates, Erwin Gershaw, Michael Gerson, Robert Gibson, Warren Gilmore, Ricardo Giovanelli, Ken Glenn, Miriam Glickman, Jerome Glicksman, Joseph Goddard Jr., Stephanie Getz, Herb Getz, Jason Goldenberg, Freddie Gonzalez, Elva Gonzalez, Richard Gooden, Sophie Goodsell, Nancy Gore, Reverend Robert Gretz, Edward Grafus, Patricia Graham, Billy Graham, Gordon Graham, Joseph Graham Mason, Paul Gray, William Gray, Forrest Gregg, Walter Gretzky, Albert Griffiths, Janice Hayhurst, Don Heath, Dave Hebner, Richard Heckman, Captain Stephen Hectus, U.S. Retired Navy, William Heedle, Peter Harold, Howard Hassan, Richard Hesser, Joseph William Heyer, Michael Hickey, Dwayne Hickman, Jack Hirschberg, Jack Hiss Jr., Jean Hoff, Anya Hoffman, Robert Hoffman, Sandra Hoffman, Jane Hoffman Bannister, Richard Holmes, Alfred Hoover, Sue Horger, Richard Horowitz, Mac Horton, John Horam, Bob Hoskins, Coleman Hugh, Kirk Howard, David Howard, Robert Howard, Dr. Joseph Howard, Howard Huberman, Gordon Hunt, Lee Lacoca, Johnny Ixison, Archie Ison, Sandra Israel, Michael Jackson, Sandy Jacobs, Esther Jacox, Jay Jaffe, Joel Jensen, Frank Jakulski, Michael Jenkins, Margaret Jerem, Pete John, Robert Johnson, Bart Johnson, Ron Johnson, Judge John Samuel Johnston Jr., Nicholas Philip Jones, Emery Elmer Jones, Larry Josephson, Larry Julian, George Catchglen III, Harry Cooligan, Barbara Kaplan Mullet, Carl Karsher, Muhammad Ali, Casey Kasem, Marilyn Cateman, Marty Coucher, Erwin Kellner, Bill Kelly, Marie Elizabeth Kennan Hafstian, Raymond Kennedy, Arnie Kent, John Kerrigan, John J. Kerrigan, Frank Kerrigan Jr., John F. Kerrigan, Clyde King, Darlene Kishner, Bjorn Killstrom, Morris Klein, Walter Klotzmeyer, Ronnie Knight, Orion Knox, William Coben, Charles Cook, Richard Cohn, Terry Collar, James Copley, Frank Kowalski, William Kramer, Richard Bernard Kransdorf, Paul Krentzman, Edward Kirstein, Larry Kripke, Donald Kroll, John Cruz, Hans Kugan, Peter Kugel, Dr. James Kumint, Michael Kuminski, Stephen Kafulmakia, Creighton Lacey Baker, David Laflamme, Art Lafleur, Robert Lally, John Landy, James Leonard, Alexia Lanning, Lois Ann Lapper, Aaron Latham, Diane Layton, Gloria Lefotsky, George Lafont, Beverly Ryan Lamberts, and John Leo.
Susan Leonard, Tom Lester, Gerald Levy, Gerald Levin, Leo Levine, Les Levine, Richard Lewis, Joseph Lewis, Gordon Liddy, Richard Ladinsky, Dr. David Leibel, Dr. Myron Lind, Monica Lindquist, John Lindsay, Bella Lipson Schreiber, Carol Lizell, Fred Long, E. Howard Long, Antonio Lopez Gutierrez, Trini Lopez III, Stranulas Lordaswamy, Barbara Love, Jan Lovell, Eugene Loya, Elliot Lubin, Tom Luddy, Toru Lura, Lord Baron Lytton Cobalt, Marcus Mabey, Carl Macklin Lee, Cargill McMillan Jr., Horace McVaugh, Gordon Madru, George Madsen, Mike Mahoney, Merrill Maldonado, Carrie Manolis, Ron Mansfield, Herschel Manser. Elizabeth Marchand, Barry Martyr, Mike Marley, John Marmon IV, David Marshall, Ingram Marshall, Reverend Ann Martin, Victor Mazaki, Joseph Mason, Batram Massing, Joseph Mateo Jr., Jason Matthews, John Maurer Jr., Gerald Mayerson, Robert McAllister, Carol McCain, Fred McCown, Bruce McDermott, James McGarity, Bruce McGrath, Supreme Court Justice Warren McGraw, Daniel McGuire, Patricia McIntosh, Buddy McPhail, Bill Meistrel, Joe Mendelson, David Mercier, Philip Meyer, Norm Meyer, Mary Meyer, Jeffrey Michaels, Edward Mike Probst, Jody Miller, John Miller, Robert Minahan, David Moberg, Jim Moeller, Dr. Amir Mohajiran, Dr. Fareed Mohammed, Rosita Montgomery, Nikki Moore, William Moore II, Mark Morman, Marty Morgenstern, Murray Morgullen, Joan Morris, Leo Morissette, Ronnie Morton, Robert Moskowitz, Irene Mata, Pote Mayung, Patrick Murphy, Mary Nastniker, Louis Nakuchi, Christopher Nelson, Bryce Nelson, Sankara Nitharlaya, Peter Newman, Herbert Newman, Gordon Nicholas Sr., Kathleen Nurzawaski, Robert Noonan, Gary O'Connell, Tom O'Connor, Dr. Dennis O'Leary, Randolph O'Neill, Maureen O'Sullivan, Robert Ocon, Charlotte Maria Offlow Johnson Wall, Trevor Oldroyd, Wah Ong, Mel Optawaski, Ken Orchard, Kay Osland, Elena Ostern, Ronald Ostro, Kenneth Ott, Sally Otten, Leonard Overcash, Philip Owen, Joanne Palmer-Rosa, Rain Park, Harry Parkhurst, Larry Parrish, Deli Pesco, Dr. Roland Patillo, Marcella Pavlinsky, Virginia Payson, Lou Perkins, Joan Peterson, Jerry Pettit, Thomas Phillips, Lois Pierce, Jim Pike, Bill Pinella, John Pizarro, Richard Pleasance, Edward Poindexter, Arthur Pomper, Colin Powell, Margaret Powell, Leah Pazel, Salvatore Prestiani, Vincent Price, Diane Prigorok, Ralph Puckett, John Puno, David Paul, Arthur Queen, Mary Queen, Donald Bracken, Alexander Rados, Paul Ragonis, Constancia Ramos, James Ransted, Bill Rankin, Frank Rao, Lee Redis, William Rayberg, Jack Reich, Lawrence Reed, Linda Risma, Mickey Reinerstein, Louis Reisman, Richard Reese, Dr. P. Rema, Catherine Remery, Sherry Raffo Usman, Janet Reno, John Wrenched, Larry Reynolds, Jeanne Reynolds Sonico, Margaret Rich, Golden Richards, David Richards, Jordan Richmond, George Rideout, Judy Reimer, Richard Riggs, Kenneth Riley, Carmelo Rendon, Esmond Roberts, Chris Roberts, Carl Robinson, Thomas Rocks, Ralph Rodley Jr., Jean Rogel Glazier, Frank Rogers, Charles Rogers, Marianne Roclina, Salvatore Ronci, Virginia Ronquillo, and Rona Rosenbaum. Back to Ivy.
Samuel Rosenberg Schneidman, Erwin Rosenstein, Edmund Ross, Lucy Rusis, Jane Flossie Rowbottom, Lawrence Rubeck, Leonard Rudolph, Judge John Roof, Ronald Ruskin, Bill Russell, David Russell, James G. Rudder Jr., Jack Hale Safco, Reza Safaipur, Lindell Samples, Manuel Santana, Rosalie Sass, Tom Sawyer, Dr. Melvin Schaff, Lyle Schaffer, David Scheller, Fred Schenerer, Anna Schifano, Percy Schmeisser, Justin Schmidt, Rold Schroeder, Jeffrey Scott, Walter Scott, Alistair Scrivener, Bill Seal, Robert Seaman, Tom Seaver, Mark Seiler, Samuel Selfman, Surajit Sengupta, Sonia Serbin Puyer, Joseph Serpa, Arthur Serwano, Joseph Sessa, Jack Sexton, Rick Schaefer, Alan Shankles, David Shannon, Robert Shapiro, Yaakov Sharir, Carl Sharp, James Sheehy, Jean Sheffrin, Barbara Shelby, Jean Shepard, Brian Sherman, Michael Shine, Mitzi Shore, Philip Short, Richard Shubin, Charlene Singer, Bob Skelly, Lieutenant Colonel George Skip Shutt Jr., Jerry Sloan, Willow Smith, Arthur Smith, Robert Smith, Donald Smith, Walter Smith, Edward Smoller, Christian So, Paul Spaz, Jonathan Spence, Ann Spencer, Tom Spires, Joanne Sprague Bolcom, Dr. Walter Jackson Stark, David Steenbergen, Richard Dick Stein, Uli Stein, Charles Stein, Norman Steinberg, Herman Steinberg Jr., Venetia Stevenson, Adlai Stevenson III, Carol Stitt, David Stone, John Stone, John Paul Stoneherner, Dr. Ross Sugar, William Solons, Harry Sutcliffe, Anne Sutherland DeRosa, Mary Talmadge, Patrick Tambay, Dr. Jerome Tamkin, Peter Tarnoff, Otis Taylor, LaDonna Taylor, Dr. David Taman, George Charos, Scott Temple, Mukhtar Thakur, Jeremy Tharcher, Roger Thibault, Myron Thielman, Millard Tip, Ronald Tober, Robert Toll, Dr. Jerry Toller, Pat Torpy, Geraldine Toussaint, David Tritel, Stephen Trevor, Estelita Trianes, John Trojanowski, Adewale Troutman, Glenn Trulock, Richard Truly, Henry Sang, Richard Tuscherer, Samuel Ursis, George Vafiatis, Merritt Van Sant, Rafael Vega, David Norwood Verdery, Dr. Daniel Viccioni, Werner Vinge, Robert Vineyard, Anthony Vitti, Quentin Vivian Rance, Christopher Waddell, Adam Wade, Carol Ann Wagner, Robert Waller, Lisa Walsh, Dale Walsh, James Walsh, Larry Warter, Ann Wasserman, Bruce Watt, Jeffrey Webb, Edward Weidenfield, Julian Weiner, Eleanor Weinstock, Stuart Weitzman, Roger Welch, Francis Wendell, Martin Wenger, Arnie Westland, Jerry Wheeler, Michael Wishaw, Fred White, Jack White, Maurice White, Ken Whitehouse, Donna Whitworth, Ardith Wygant, James Wilding, Lawrence Wilkie, Harry Williams, Robin Williams, Beverly Willis, Ted Wilson, David Wilson, Ben Wood III, John Woodcock Jr., Sandra Woods, Gary Wright, Lim Yan, Stephen Yon, Margaret York, Douglas York, Thomas Young, Royce Yust, Steve Zachary, Ronald Zaki, Alexander Zale, Robin Zerider, Ruth Zerider, Alan Zaslov, Virginia Zeidman, Norm Ziegler, and Frances Louise Zostant. So that concludes our recitation of names for today. I want to remind everyone that we do have a number of resources that are available for people with Parkinson's and caregivers. We have support groups, including Grief Group, which is both anticipatory and bereavement grief. We have our memorial wall where you can read the stories of each of the individuals that we named today. And I think it's also worth remembering that this is an incomplete list. And until we find a cure for Parkinson's, we will continue to add to this legacy. Parkinson's Resource Organization is here for you on every step of the journey. You can find us at www.parkinsonsresource.org. You can always give us a call at 760-773-5628, and we are here to answer your questions. Thank you.